It was Valentine's weekend, 1974, the kind of night that small-town Texas was built for. Fort Worth shimmered under the glow of neon lights and gas stations, the smell of fried food drifting from roadside diners. Teenagers cruised along University Drive in their Chevys and Mustangs, windows down, radios humming love songs from the Bee Gees and Elton John. Carla Walker, 17, was one of those kids, bright, beautiful, full of life. She'd spent the evening at a Valentine's dance with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, a local football star. They were the perfect couple. Carla, the cheerleader with the soft brown hair and kind eyes. Rodney, the athlete with an easy smile. In the photos from that night, you can see them both laughing, caught in the soft flash of a Polaroid camera. Two teenagers frozen in a moment that felt like forever. After the dance, they stopped at a nearby bowling alley, a hangout spot for local teens. They stayed until just before midnight, sipping cokes and talking about college plans. It was one of those ordinary nights that would have faded into memory, if not for what happened next. When they pulled into a secluded parking spot near Benbrook Lake, the air was still and cold, the windows fogged with their breath. They talked, kissed, and for a few quiet minutes, the world outside didn't exist. Then, chaos. A sudden slam on the driver's window. A hand reached in, yanking the door open. A man's voice shouted. Before Rodney could react, the stranger was on him, pistol whipping him across the head again and again. Carla screamed. Rodney tried to fight back, but the blows came faster, harder. Then, darkness. When he woke up, the passenger door was open and Carla was gone. He stumbled from the car, bleeding, dazed, calling her name into the cold Texas night. His cries echoed down the empty road. No one answered. By dawn, police were combing through the area. They found Carla's purse, her shoe, and blood on the passenger seat. The newspapers would later call it the Valentine's nightmare. For 3 days, Fort Worth held its breath. Parents kept their kids home from school. Volunteers searched fields, drainage ditches, the woods near Benbrook Lake. Her family refused to leave their home. They sat by the phone, waiting for a call that never came. Then, on February 20th, a man walking near a culvert off I-20 noticed something strange. At first, he thought it was a mannequin, but as he got closer, the truth hit him like a wave of ice. It was Carla. Her body had been stuffed inside a drainage pipe. She was still wearing the same light blue dress from the Valentine's dance. Her hands were bound. She had been brutally assaulted and strangled. Fort Worth police descended on the scene. Reporters followed. The story made headlines across Texas. A pretty cheerleader, a romantic night, a brutal end. The town's innocence shattered overnight. Rodney was questioned for hours. He told the same story every time, the man, the gun, the attack. But there were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no witnesses, just fear. Detectives pulled in dozens of suspects, truckers, soldiers from nearby Carswell Air Force Base, local men with criminal records. One name briefly surfaced, Glenn Samuel McCurley, a 31-year-old mechanic who owned a .22 Ruger pistol, the same kind of weapon used in the attack. But McCurley passed a polygraph, denied everything, and without physical evidence, police let him go. And that was it. The weeks turned into months, the months into years. Carla's classmates graduated, got married, moved away. Her photo, that radiant Valentine's night smile, hung in the Fort Worth Police Department, gathering dust. Her parents, Leighton and Doris Walker, never stopped calling detectives. Every time the phone rang, Doris said she could feel her heart stop for a moment, hoping it was the call that would tell her who did it. It never was. By the 1980s, the case had gone cold. The evidence, including a small vial containing DNA from the crime scene, was sealed and stored. Forgotten by most, but not by everyone. Detective Jim Level, one of the investigators, once said, "You never really forget a case like Carla's. You just get older waiting for something to change." And something would change, just not yet. Because somewhere in Fort Worth, in a modest little house on the edge of town, a man lived quietly, mowing his lawn, drinking coffee on his porch, waving to his neighbors. The same man who had stolen a teenage girl's future and walked free for nearly half a century. It would take 46 years, a drop of preserved DNA, and a new kind of detective work, one that used the bloodline of a killer's own family to finally break the silence. But that night in 1974, that was the moment everything began. Fort Worth police threw everything they had at the case in those first few weeks. The murder of a 17-year-old cheerleader on Valentine's weekend, no less, sent shockwaves through the entire community. The city wasn't used to this kind of brutality. It wasn't Los Angeles or New York. This was Texas, 1974, where people left their doors unlocked and bad things happened somewhere else. Now somewhere else had arrived, right in their backyard. Detectives worked around the clock, following every lead, chasing every rumor. They interviewed friends, classmates, teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen Carla that night. Hundreds of tips came in. Most led nowhere. At first, suspicion fell on the person closest to her, her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. He was the last person to see her alive. He'd been knocked unconscious in the attack, but when he came to, she was gone. To the investigators, that detail was a problem. His story sounded too wild to be true. A random man, out of nowhere, attacking them on a quiet street and vanishing into the night. They questioned him for hours. They asked if they'd argued, if he'd been jealous, if something had gone too far that night. But Rodney stuck to his story, even when detectives pressed hard. He described the man, a large figure, maybe in his 30s, wearing a cowboy hat, holding what looked like a small pistol. The man's voice was gruff, his movements quick. Rodney remembered being struck, the pain exploding behind his eyes, and then nothing. He broke down more than once during questioning. And while his story never changed, the lack of solid evidence kept him under the shadow of suspicion for decades. Meanwhile, forensic science in 1974 was primitive compared to today. There were no DNA databases, no computers capable of cross-referencing genetic markers. Investigators relied on fingerprints, shoe prints, and instinct. They collected what they could: fibers from Carla's dress, hair strands, and one crucial piece of evidence: a semen sample from her body and clothes. At the time, it was just labeled biological material. No one knew that, decades later, this would be the single thread that would finally unravel the mystery. Back then, they had to work with what they had. A few witnesses claimed they'd seen a suspicious car, a light-colored 1970s Oldsmobile, parked near the bowling alley that night. Detectives tracked down dozens of similar cars, interviewed the owners, and even went door to door across the county. Then a potential break. A man named Glenn Samuel McCurley came up on the radar. He matched the rough description. He lived near the area, and more importantly, he owned a .22 Ruger pistol, the same caliber as the gun used in the assault. When officers arrived at his home, McCurley was polite, even cooperative. He said he'd heard about the murder on the news and felt terrible for the family. He told police he had sold that pistol years earlier because it had been stolen from his car. They gave him a polygraph test. He passed. There wasn't enough to charge him. He was crossed off the list. Years later, one of the original detectives would say, "Looking back, we were standing right next to the man. We just didn't have the tools to see it." With every year that passed, the leads grew colder. Witnesses moved away, some died. New detectives came on, looked at the file, and quietly moved it to the back of the shelf. By the 1980s, the case file, once overflowing with evidence bags and handwritten notes, was just another dusty binder in a police archive. But Carla's family refused to let her name fade. Her parents appeared on local TV, begging anyone with information to come forward. "Please," her father said in one interview, his voice trembling, "don't let my little girl be forgotten." Still, nothing came. In 2004, a new cold case unit briefly revisited the evidence. The DNA sample was retested, but again, it didn't match anyone in CODIS, the national DNA database. Whoever killed Carla wasn't in the system. The detectives made a public statement: "We haven't given up, we're waiting for technology to catch up." And so, the waiting continued. For 46 years, the Walker case remained one of Fort Worth's deepest scars, a reminder that justice sometimes hides behind the limits of its own era. Meanwhile, the killer, Glenn McCurley, went on living an ordinary life. He raised a family, went to work, attended church. He grew old in the same town that still whispered Carla's name. He probably thought he'd gotten away with it, and for nearly half a century, he had. But in 2019, a new generation of detectives opened that same old evidence box. Inside was the DNA sample, perfectly preserved. And this time, they had something that 1974 detectives could never dream of: genetic genealogy. That single drop of DNA was about to rewrite everything. 46 years is a lifetime. Generations grew up, technology transformed the world, and Fort Worth evolved from a quiet Texas city into a modern metropolis. But in one small evidence box, buried deep in the cold case archives of the Fort Worth Police Department, a few sealed envelopes still whispered the name Carla Walker. In 2019, Detective Leah Wagner and her team from the Cold Case unit decided to take one more look. It wasn't that they expected a miracle. After all, this case had been reopened and closed more times than anyone could count. But there was something about it that haunted every investigator who came across it. When they pulled the evidence from storage, the labels were fading, the handwriting yellowed. But inside one of the envelopes was the same DNA sample collected in 1974. A small vial that had somehow survived time, heat, and neglect. This time, the detectives had a new ally, genetic genealogy. In partnership with Othram Labs, a forensic DNA lab in the Woodlands, Texas, they began the process of sequencing the DNA and uploading it into a public database called GIDmatch, the same technology that had recently helped catch the Golden State Killer. Within weeks, a family tree began to form. Distant relatives, cousins, generations of connections leading to one small cluster of names. And at the center of that cluster, an old file number appeared again, Glenn Samuel McCurley. It was a name buried deep in the original 1974 suspect list, a man who'd been questioned, passed a polygraph, and quietly faded into obscurity. Detective Wagner stared at the computer screen, her heartbeat quickening. "We had him all along," she whispered. They pulled up McCurley's records. Born in 1943, worked as a mechanic, married, 2 sons, no criminal record, lived in the same area for decades. The picture that emerged was unsettling, an ordinary man who had blended into the background of everyday life for nearly half a century. When investigators visited his neighborhood in 2020, they found him living in a small, tidy house with a white porch and a mowed lawn. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who waved when he drove by. But detectives knew better. They began surveillance, watching his routines. They followed him to the gas station, to the grocery store, to his mailbox. Then one morning, he took out the trash. Detectives waited until he went back inside, then collected a few items: a soda can, a used tissue from the garbage. The lab results came back 2 days later. It was a perfect match. 46 years after Carla Walker was taken, her killer had finally been found. On September 21st, 2020, Fort Worth police knocked on McCurley's door. He answered calmly, his face blank. "Mr. McCurley," one of the detectives said, "we'd like to talk to you about an old case." He nodded slowly, as if he already knew which one. At the station, they told him they had DNA evidence. They told him they knew it was him. For a long moment, McCurley said nothing. Then he exhaled and said softly, "I guess you got me." His confession was chillingly matter-of-fact. He admitted to following Carla and Rodney that night, seeing their car parked and attacking them. He said he hadn't planned it, that it just happened. When he realized she was dead, he panicked, stuffed her body into the drain pipe, and left. He spoke about it like it was a bad memory he'd tucked away and forgotten, something he could live with because the world had let him. When news of the arrest broke, Fort Worth froze. People who had lived through the 1970s remembered exactly where they were when Carla's body was found. Many of them still lived in the same town. Neighbors couldn't believe it. He was just normal, one said. Always smiled, never thought twice about him. Carla's surviving family members wept when detectives called with the news. Her brother Jim said, "We prayed for this day. We didn't know if we'd live to see it." In 2021, McCurley pled guilty to murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, when asked if he wanted to say anything, he simply said no. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend, the boy who'd been beaten unconscious that night, sat in the courtroom, gray-haired now, with tears streaming down his face. For decades, some had quietly suspected him. He told reporters later, "It's like I can breathe again." It took 46 years, but the truth finally spoke. For the detectives who worked the case, the moment was both triumphant and haunting. "We had everything we needed in 1974, one of them said. "We just didn't have the science." That's what makes this story so unforgettable. It's not just about DNA. It's about time, justice, and the quiet persistence of truth. Carla's parents didn't live to see the day her killer was caught, but maybe somewhere beyond, they finally found peace. And for the city of Fort Worth, the shadow that had loomed since 1974 finally began to lift. When the news broke that Carla Walker's killer had finally been caught, Fort Worth stopped in its tracks. It had been 46 years since her body was found, nearly half a century of unanswered questions, rumors, and pain. For many in the city, Carla's story wasn't just a crime. It was a wound that had never healed. Teachers still remembered the candlelight vigil in 1974. Some of her classmates had grown old telling their children, "Be careful walking home." And the detectives who had worked the case in their youth were now in their 70s, watching the news with tears in their eyes. It felt like time itself had folded back. When Glenn Samuel McCurley stood before the court in 2021, he didn't look like the monster people had imagined for decades. He looked like someone's grandfather, gray hair, soft voice, trembling hands. But that's what made it worse. Evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it smiles from the next pew over at church. The courtroom was packed. Survivors, reporters, old detectives, all waiting for justice that had been delayed but never denied. Carla's brother Jim Walker took the stand, holding a photo of his sister from 1974, her smile bright, her hair in soft curls. "You took her life," he said, his voice breaking, "but you didn't take her spirit, because she's right here, in this courtroom, in all of us who never stopped fighting for her." For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint click of reporters' cameras. When the judge read the sentence, life in prison without parole, Jim closed his eyes and whispered, "We did it, baby." The impact of Carla's case went far beyond one courtroom. It became a turning point for cold case investigations across Texas and the nation. The successful use of forensic genealogy in the Walker case proved that no matter how old the evidence, there was still hope if someone was willing to look hard enough. After McCurley's conviction, the Fort Worth Police Department received a surge of funding to expand their cold case unit. Detectives began re-examining dozens of unsolved murders from the 1970s and 1980s, reopening evidence boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. Across the country, families with long-forgotten cases started to believe again. Mothers, sisters, and brothers of victims reached out to investigators, asking if their loved one's DNA could be tested with the same technology. Carla's story became proof that time doesn't always protect the guilty. For the city itself, something deeper changed. Fort Worth had carried this shadow since 1974. Parents of that generation never forgot the fear, how they started locking doors, escorting their kids to school, watching every stranger twice. Carla's murder had rewritten the town's innocence. Now her case had rewritten its faith in justice. Local news stations ran retrospectives titled "The Girl Who Never Gave Up." At her old high school, a memorial bench was placed near the gymnasium, engraved with her name. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a small group gathers there, classmates now in their 60s, to leave flowers and remember the girl who should have had a lifetime ahead of her. One of them said to a reporter, "It's strange. I still see her face when I walk these halls. She never aged. She's still 17. But the story's power doesn't just come from technology or justice. It comes from what it reveals about human persistence, the refusal to let a name disappear into the archives. Detective Leah Wagner once said in an interview, "Cold cases aren't really cold. They're waiting for the right eyes, the right heart, the right moment." For her, solving Carla's murder wasn't about closing a file. It was about reopening faith, in truth, in science, and in the idea that no one, not even a small-town girl from 1970s Texas, should be forgotten. At the sentencing, one journalist asked Jim Walker what justice meant after 46 years. He paused for a long time before answering. "Justice isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about peace. For my mom, for my dad, for Rodney, for everyone who carried this pain, we can finally breathe again." In the years since the verdict, true crime enthusiasts, podcasters, and documentary filmmakers have revisited Carla's story, not for its horror, but for its hope. Because in the end, this isn't just a story about a murder. It's about endurance, the strength of a family who refused to give up, the determination of detectives who believed in dusty evidence, and the miracle of science that reached across decades to speak the truth. Today, if you drive down that quiet road near Benbrook Lake, it looks peaceful. You'd never guess what happened there. But somewhere in the hum of cicadas and the whisper of the Texas wind, you can almost hear the echo of a young girl's laughter, the one who never came home, but whose story finally did. "Justice can wait," Detective Wagner said softly, standing outside the courthouse after the sentencing. "But it can't hide forever." The story of Carla Walker didn't just close a cold case, it ignited a revolution. When detectives in Fort Worth used genetic genealogy to identify Glenn Samuel McCurley, it marked more than justice for one family. It symbolized a new age in criminal investigation, where science could speak for the silenced, and time itself could no longer protect the guilty. A new era of forensic justice. Before the Carla Walker case, genealogy-based DNA investigation was still viewed with skepticism. The Golden State Killer case had opened the door, yes, but Carla's case proved that the method wasn't a one-time miracle. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Carla's DNA evidence had sat in a lab freezer for nearly half a century. Old samples like that weren't supposed to survive. But thanks to meticulous preservation and the capabilities of modern sequencing, those fragile genetic traces turned into a full profile, one that could be uploaded to public genealogy databases like GIDmatch and Family Tree DNA. From there, it only took a few strands of DNA from distant relatives, maybe a second cousin twice removed, to rebuild McCurley's entire family tree. Within weeks, the net closed. The message was clear: if you've left your DNA behind, the clock may stop, but justice won't. The national ripple effect. After the McCurley conviction, law enforcement agencies across the U.S. began dusting off their oldest unsolved murders. From small towns in Arkansas to big cities like Chicago, detectives contacted labs like Othram, Parabon Nanolabs, and the FBI's genealogy unit to re-examine evidence once thought useless. Cold case detectives started using Carla's case as a model, a playbook for persistence. Her story became a training example in police academies. It showed that even when evidence feels too old or too degraded, you never truly know what might be hiding in a single cell. In just 2 years after McCurley's arrest, more than 400 cold cases were reopened using the same DNA genealogy methods, many of them dating back to the 1970s and 80s. Families who had been living in silence for decades suddenly received phone calls. "We found him. We got a match. It's finally over." And every time those words were spoken, Carla Walker's story was echoing in the background. The ethical crossroads. But this new wave of justice didn't come without controversy. As genealogy exploded in popularity, with millions of Americans uploading their DNA to find long-lost relatives, some began asking, how far should law enforcement go? Should people's family DNA meant for ancestry exploration be used to catch killers? Some privacy advocates warned that innocent people could be swept into investigations because a distant cousin uploaded their DNA. Others feared misuse by the government. Detectives, however, argued that the balance leaned toward justice. "We're not using it to spy on people," said Detective Wagner in a 2021 interview. "We're using it to give victims a voice, the kind of voice they were denied in life." The debate continues, but one thing is undeniable. For families like the Walkers, the ability to finally know the truth is worth the cost. The human side of forensics. In Fort Worth, the cold case unit expanded into a full department with funding for training, new equipment, and partnerships with forensic labs across the country. But what changed most wasn't the science, it was the attitude. Old detectives came out of retirement to volunteer. Younger officers took classes in genetic genealogy, and families once ignored or dismissed found new compassion waiting for them when they called. In interviews, Detective Wagner often says, "Science can solve crimes, but humanity solves grief." The legacy of a small-town girl. Today, Carla Walker's story continues to inspire true crime filmmakers, podcasters, and writers across the U.S. Her name appears in documentaries about cold cases, genetic breakthroughs, and the power of persistence. But perhaps the most powerful legacy isn't on a screen or in a courtroom, it's in the living, in the people her story has touched. There's a scholarship in her name at her old high school for students pursuing forensic science. Her brother Jim often speaks at crime victim support events, telling others not to lose faith in time. He ends every talk the same way. If they tell you your case is too old, tell them about Carla. A future built on the past. Since 2020, genetic genealogy has helped identify more than 1,000 unknown victims and killers nationwide. Some were hiding in plain sight for decades, just like McCurley. But each solved case carries a deeper message. There's no such thing as getting away with it anymore. Even now, across labs in Texas, California, and Virginia, rows of small vials sit frozen, each one a name, a story, a truth waiting to be told. Detectives open those freezers and whisper the same promise: "We haven't forgotten you." In 1974, a frightened town buried a teenage girl and prayed for justice. In 2020, that prayer was answered. Carla's voice may have been silenced that night, but her story roared through time, breaking scientific barriers, reshaping law enforcement, and reminding the world that even the coldest cases can burn bright again. The Fort Worth sky was clear the day they dedicated the memorial bench to Carla Walker. It sat beneath an old oak tree outside Western Hills High School, the same campus where she once laughed with friends, cheered at football games, and dreamed about the future she never got to live. A single word was carved into the stone beneath her name: remembered. The weight of memory. For nearly 5 decades, Carla's story lingered in the corners of Fort Worth, whispered in classrooms, mentioned at church, haunting the edges of dinner table conversations. Parents used her name as a warning. Teenagers dared each other to drive by Benbrook Lake at night. Now those same people, older, grayer, came to the bench ceremony, holding flowers and quiet tears. Detective Leah Wagner stood off to the side, watching the crowd. She wasn't alive when Carla was killed, but she'd spent years with her photograph taped to the cold case board. She once said, "I felt like I knew her. I felt like she was waiting for someone to finish what others started." When they caught Glenn McCurley, Wagner thought the story was over. But justice, she learned, doesn't end with an arrest. It lingers, just like grief. The man who lived 2 lives. After the conviction, journalists and documentarians tried to piece together who Glenn Samuel McCurley really was. To his neighbors, he was a quiet man, a husband, a father, a mechanic. He fixed engines, paid his bills, and attended Sunday services. But inside his home, detectives found old photographs, a few newspaper clippings from the 1970s, and an eerie handwritten note that simply read, "Nobody remembers the past like I do." He had built a normal life on top of a nightmare, carrying his secret like a second skin. He wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. He was a man blending into the daylight. And that realization shook the community even more than the crime itself. It made people question everything. How many others were out there, smiling faces with buried sins? How many ordinary lives were built on someone else's silence? The price of time. The Walker family never got the ending they once imagined. Carla's parents died before they could see her killer brought to justice. But her brother Jim Walker, who carried her photo for nearly 50 years, found a strange peace in the trial's aftermath. "Justice doesn't erase pain," he said in an interview. "It just makes it easier to live with." Jim became an advocate for other families of cold case victims, speaking at police seminars and true crime events across the country. He always started his speech with the same line: "Time doesn't kill truth, people do, and people can bring it back." The lessons left behind. Carla's case changed how law enforcement thought about unsolved murders, not just in Texas but nationwide. Police departments realized that cold didn't mean dead. Advances in DNA genealogy, digital archiving, and AI-enhanced forensics meant that any old case file could still be alive, if someone had the heart to look. More importantly, the case reminded detectives that empathy is evidence too. The Fort Worth Cold Case Unit started holding community outreach nights, inviting victims' families to speak directly with detectives. Some nights were painful, filled with tears and frustration, but other nights sparked new leads, even decades-old ones. Because sometimes the truth isn't in a lab, it's in a memory someone was too afraid to share, until they saw what happened to Carla Walker. Beyond Fort Worth, Carla's story spread far beyond Texas. Podcasters dissected it, documentaries replayed it, YouTube storytellers turned it into modern folklore. Not for the shock value, but for the emotional weight of watching technology finally catch up to tragedy. Every retelling became a kind of resurrection, a reminder that history doesn't have to fade if we keep speaking the names of the lost. And while the internet can often exploit tragedy, in Carla's case it did something rare. It amplified justice. Viewers around the world learned that a single preserved vial of DNA, a persistent detective, and a family that refused to give up could rewrite a 46-year-old story. The circle closes. In one of his last interviews, Jim Walker stood beside his sister's memorial bench, looking out over the school grounds. "People ask me if I hate him," he said, referring to McCurley. He paused for a long time, then added quietly, "I did, for a long time. But I realized hate keeps her story chained to him, and that's not fair to Carla." He smiled sadly, wiping his eyes. "She's free now, and that's all I ever wanted." As he spoke, a group of high school students walked by, laughing, the same age Carla had been when she died. They stopped to look at the plaque, some whispering her name softly. And in that moment, she was remembered, not as a victim, but as a voice that helped others find their way out of the dark. The last word. When the court clerk filed the final paperwork marking the case as closed, Detective Wagner placed a yellow sticky note on the front of the file. It read, "Carla Walker, never forgotten. Case solved, 2020. She left it there because sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a quiet moment of closure, a small act of remembrance after decades of silence. If you drive through Fort Worth today, there's no sign of the horror that once unfolded. The city has moved on, but in its heart there's a space reserved for a girl with blue eyes, a bright smile, and dreams she never got to chase. She may be gone, but her story, her courage, her echo will never fade. Time can bury truth, Jim Walker once said, but it can't kill it. You just have to keep digging."